As I mentioned, we're going to be continuing our series in the life of Elijah tonight. So if you'd like to get out a Bible, we're going to be in 1 Kings 19. 1 Kings 19. We'll be back, I should say, in 1 Kings 19 because that is where we left off in Elijah's story. And as you get there, I'd like to try and frame this story with a few details that we haven't really been dwelling on so much to this point. And I'd like to point a few things out tonight as we kind of get started that really help me at least to... I find these really interesting, and it also kind of helps us to think about what this might have actually been like for Elijah, the person, to go through some of these events. So if you kind of take a step back, look at where we've been, these last few major events in the life of Elijah, Scripture leaves us these little breadcrumbs that we can follow to kind of trace where he's actually going. And it really breaks down into really four places, four locations that are important. So in Elijah's journey, these past few chapters, first it was Mount Carmel. And we saw that that's where the big showdown went down with God and Elijah versus Ahab and the prophets of Baal. And when they had won that great victory there, Elijah then, we're told that he runs. He doesn't just travel or walk. He literally runs to this next place called Jezreel. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But then he gets to Jezreel and he found that his life was still in danger. Queen Jezebel was out to get him. And so Queen Jezebel searches out this manhunt for Elijah, and they're going to try and take and kill him. And so we saw then that he went down to the city called Beersheba, and near Beersheba is where we left him last week, where he finally just falls down beneath this broom tree. And he's so exhausted, physically and spiritually and emotionally, just so weary, that he wishes he would just die there. And that's where we left off. Elijah's so weary. And we ask this question, what does God do for a person like Elijah? What does God do for a person like us when we have weary eyes and burdened hearts and frustrations and fears and doubts? And we began to see the answer to that question last week. We're going to talk more about it this week. Last week we saw that God was tending to Elijah's whole person, right? Especially his physical needs. And so God gives Elijah the bread that he needs and the water that he needs. And Elijah rests, and God gives him these things to literally strengthen him for the journey that is ahead of him. And now today we're going to see that Elijah takes that journey ahead of him. And it leads him to our fourth and final place, this place called Mount Horeb. So chapter 19, verse 8, strengthened by the food that the angel of the Lord gave to him, Elijah traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night there. So that's the last place, Mount Horeb, which is otherwise known as Mount Sinai. And it's called the mountain of God here for a reason, because at some times in history, most notably in the Exodus, God, his presence descended upon that mountain in this powerful display of earth-shaking presence. And he gave Moses the law in the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. All of that happened here where Elijah is now. So now Elijah's here. He's come to Mount Horeb by way of Beersheba, by way of Jezreel, by way of Mount Carmel. And here's the thing I want to point out about that. Now, we don't know the exact routes that Elijah would have taken, but think about this. From Carmel to Jezreel, somewhere between 17 and 30 miles. And remember, that's the part that Elijah ran. Ran this span of miles from Mount Carmel to Jezreel. In fact, he ran faster than Ahab's chariots, which means he went really, really fast, or the conditions were really, really bad, or both. But he starts this off by running a marathon, basically, give or take. And I'm not a math person, so we're going to go with 30 miles. That's the first leg. And then he finds that his life is in danger, so he flees from Jezreel to Beersheba, from way up north in Israel, down to the south in Judah. And that leg of the journey is about 100 miles. This might be, if you count the fact that he's not running the whole thing, this might qualify as the easiest leg of the journey. Running for his life, fleeing from the north part of Israel all the way down to Beersheba. He finds that tree and falls down under it. He doesn't want to take another step from that place. But he eats the food, he rests twice, and then he's up and going again. 40 days and 40 nights, and now he's not even in Israel or Judah anymore. Remember, we said this mountain is the same one as Mount Sinai. What were the Israelites doing when they got to Mount Sinai? They were wandering in the wilderness. That wilderness wandering period, that's when they were at Mount Sinai, on their way to get to the promised land. So Elijah has now gone out of northern Israel, out of Judah, all the way back into the wilderness of old in Exodus. And 40 days and 40 nights he travels to Mount Horeb. 260 miles he travels just to get to this one place. So all in, and again, I'm not a math guy, so I rounded this. All in these 2 chapters, these 4 places, we're talking about a journey here of something like 400 miles. I give you a map of it here. It's not a beautiful map, but it was hard to find a map that had all 4 of these places. So spread out is the last one from the other 3. So I'll give you a few other ways to think about this. Maybe one of these will stick with you. If you were to go from here past Wichita into the middle of Kansas, that'd be about as far as Elijah goes. About our Harding people. Any Harding people? Searcy, Arkansas is almost exactly 400 miles from here. So why not just walk next time, right? That's what Elijah does. Texas is a huge state, so Corpus Christi to the southeast, that's about as far as Elijah goes. If you go northwest, you go past Amarillo and into this little town in New Mexico, I can't remember which, would be about the same distance that Elijah travels here. So Elijah travels a long way, a long, exhausting way to get to this one place, Mount Horeb, which is called the mountain of God. He goes all this way to get there. And do you know what God's first words are to Elijah when he gets there? 400 miles he travels, give or take. God's first words to him: "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here?" These are the first words he hears from God when he gets to this mountain. So Elijah reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. He went into a cave. He spent the night there. In verse 9, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here?" Now, how about that for a question to stop you in your tracks, right? How would you like to hear that question after you have traveled 400 miles over mountains and desert to get to this place? Running for your life, you unpack your bag, spend a night in a cave. To hear God say, "What are you doing here?" How would that question come across to you? It makes me wonder, does God want Elijah to be here? Because for Elijah, that question is like lighting a fuse. God asked him, "What are you doing here?" And the next verse, it just all blows up. All the frustration he's had bottled up inside of him. He replies, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. You get the sense, you can imagine that he's almost angry when he says these words, right? He's come all this way. And he's right when he says he has been very zealous. And the Israelites have rejected the covenant, and they have torn down the altars, and his own life is in danger. And besides, if God didn't want him to come to this mountain, to come to Mount Horeb, I can imagine Elijah wondering, then why didn't you just leave me under the broom tree? That's where he wanted to be. He came to that spot and basically announced, I'm not going any further. But then God sent an angel to him to strengthen him so that he could take this journey. The journey to here. And then he gets to here, the cave, and God says, what are you doing here? Imagine how Elijah must feel. Can you understand why he sounds so frustrated when God says, what are you doing here? Here's the thing I've been thinking about, though. Just because God says, what are you doing here? That doesn't mean God doesn't want him here. And God has a purpose for him here. We're about to see it. So God said to Elijah, verse 11, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now, for those of you who may remember this story, this next part is probably the part you remember. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. One translation I read said the sound of sheer silence. Another, a gentle breeze. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face. When he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave, then a voice said to him the second time, what are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? As if to say, I don't think you really got my question the first time. Do I have your attention now? After the wind and the earthquake and the fire and the gentle breeze? What are you doing here? You see, I've been thinking a lot about this question that God asks Elijah, and what I'm coming to realize is that Elijah and God may just be thinking about two different things. Elijah hears this question and he immediately responds, don't you know what brought me here? Don't you know what I've done for you and what has been done to me? What I've been through? Didn't you bring me here, Lord? I came here for you. This was your journey. I thought you wanted me to come here. And so the second time God asks him that, he responds the same way with frustration. Verse 14, if it looks like deja vu, it is word for word identical to verse 10. Elijah says the same frustrated things that he said to begin with. So even the second time, Elijah's perturbed by this question. But what if God meant something different with his question than, why are you standing in this cave? Or, what happened to bring you here? What if when God says, what are you doing here? It's more like this. What are you doing here, Elijah? Are you giving up? What are you doing here, Elijah? Are you losing hope? What are you doing here? Are you hiding out? Are you here to stay? Is this where you're planning to stay from now on? Or are you going to come back? Are you going to start new? You see the difference there? I really think God's asking a bigger question than why are you in this location? I think he's asking a soul-searching question. Almost a what are you going to do now question for Elijah's heart. I thought of it like this. Imagine like a young boy gets really embarrassed or ashamed or really angry at his parents. And he runs away from home. Packs up his stuff in a bag and just heads out to his favorite spot in the woods. I'm thinking about, like, maybe there's a little tree house in the woods that he and his dad built together. He heads out there. The boy knows exactly that his dad knows where to find him. The dad knows where he's going to go when he runs away. So imagine that dad waits just a little while, an hour or two. And the boy sits there sulking in his hideaway place, licking his wounds for a bit. And then his dad goes out to find him. From his hideout, the boy can hear the leaves crackling, the twigs snapping, and it gets a little louder as Dad gets closer to him. He hears Dad climbing the wooden stairs up to the treehouse, ducks his head as he goes in. And then father and son are looking into each other's eyes for a minute. And Dad can see all the stuff, all of it, the frustration, the embarrassment, the hurt, in his boy's eyes. And they just sit there for a minute in silence. Now, if that father says to his son, "What are you doing here, son?" He's not really asking, like, how did you get here? Or why did you come here? Or, you're not supposed to be here. And that father says, "What are you doing here, son?" Isn't he really saying, "I'm with you. I see you. But what now? Where do you go from here?" I think that's what God is asking Elijah to search out in his soul. And when God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" he's also kind of prodding him to choose another way. I think about him saying to Elijah, "You could be here given up, but I'm here with you quietly reminding you, don't give up. I'm here to remind you that the God who is more powerful than the wind and the earthquake and the fire, that God whispers to you, I'm with you. Be still and know that I am God." And Elijah, you could be here losing hope because you're frustrated and you're tired and you're feeling alone. But I am here to reassure you that you're not alone. Later on, God's going to say, "I've preserved 7,000 others in Israel who are faithful like you are faithful, Elijah." 7,000 people who can begin to relate a little bit with what you're going through, Elijah, who may have faced some similar challenges. God is reassuring him. I'm here to reassure you that you're not alone. And Elijah, you could be here planning to hide out and shut out this cruel, cruel world because of all the things it's done to you. And because every time you give so much to it, it never seems to be enough. But I'm here to say, there's still work to do. I'm not here to just remind you and reassure you that you're not alone, but I found you here to recommission you. And the word out of God's mouth is go. Verse 15, go back to where you came from. Go. Go back to the north. Go back to the work. Back to the calling that I gave you. Renew your courage. Restore your calling. Isn't that more what this question is all about? What are you doing here, Elijah? To Elijah, that might have first seemed like an accusation or a trigger for his frustration, or really just kind of a callous thing to say when you've come all this way and been through all of this to get here. But in fact, God had this purpose in him coming all this way. God brought him here to a place where his presence was known to be so that he could speak to his soul. God uses this moment at the end of a long journey to remind and reassure and recommission his child, who he loves very much. So that when Elijah goes out from here, he can know that God is with him. And he can know that other people are with him too. And Elijah can go from here recharged, reassured, and ready to do the work that he can do for God. And I wonder if that's not the same thing that this story says to us as well. I heard about a preacher one time, or read the sermon of a preacher one time. That his name was Wesley Allen, and he was comparing Elijah's journey to the cave as kind of being like us Christians when we gather together at church, like we do from week to week. And I think that what he meant is that we too can wrestle with this same question as if to us. What are you doing here, church? What are we here? Like Elijah, sometimes we come to this place or we gather online, set outside the time to do this. Sometimes we're in the midst of periods of life where we have frustrations in us, or fears in us, or doubts in us, weary eyes, burdened hearts. And coming here week after week after week and investing in this can be strenuous. Maybe sometimes the thing we really want to say to God deep down is, look, you wanted me here, I'm here. Isn't that enough? Maybe sometimes we're worn down and we're weighed down so much that even when we're there, it's hard to listen to that still small voice speaking to our souls. Maybe sometimes we come here wishing we could be here and only here and just put out that world, that cruel, cruel world, and never have to deal with it again. Just hide away. Elijah can relate with all of those things and then some. And God, knowing that, brings him into his presence. Works with him there. But don't be surprised if God also gently whispers to us, what are you doing here, church? Don't be surprised if God is persistent in trying to not just get us here to a place, but to speak to our souls and challenge us and change us. So I wonder if we also could learn to hear this question a little better. Elijah struggled with this question. It made him angry. But I wonder if we can allow these moments when we're gathered together to give us something that we really need to recharge our souls. When we gather together on a night like tonight, we sing songs that remind us to be still and know the Lord is God. He is more powerful than the wind and the fire and the quake and the things in our lives too. When we gather tonight, even in our smaller Wednesday gatherings compared to a Sunday morning, you can look around this room. You can know from the fact that you're participating with us online that you're not alone. You can be reassured that there are others like you who share similar burdens sometimes and who have the same desire to be faithful to the Lord. We get that here. And when we gather, we are reminded that it's not just for the sake of gathering a couple times a week. We also are sent from this place. That word go is a word for us too. As we're reminded, God believes there's still work to do in this world. And we get to play a part in it. Like Elijah, God brings us together for a purpose. So the question I leave you with tonight is, will we listen? When God says to us, what are you doing here, church? Well, maybe that question challenges you this week. Maybe what you need to do in your life is pay closer attention to the still, quiet voice of God. Maybe what you needed today was that encouragement, that reassurance that Elijah finds in this moment, to know that he is not alone. Maybe what you need today is to be sent out, not closed off from this world in which God is working, but ready to do our part. However you may be called or challenged, let's listen to God speaking to our souls while we stand and while we sing.